I went on a solo trip to a secluded forest cabin last weekend. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than some time away from everything. Just me, the trees, the rain, and a couple of books. The first evening went just as planned. I settled into the tiny cabin, lit a fire in the wood stove, and listened to the rain tapping gently against the windows. The place was far from town, barely even reachable by car. You had to hike the last mile. No cell service, no neighbors. My aunt used to bring me here when I was younger. It was our quiet place. In all the years I'd come with her, we never saw another soul. The second day it was still raining hard, even more so. The path outside was just soft, muddy slush. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and watching the rain fall on the windows, and the trees blow in the wind. I brought a few books, but I ended up reading Twilight again. It felt right because of the bad weather and being all alone. I even laughed at myself a little, curling up with that book like I was still 15, waiting for a vampire to knock on the window. In the late afternoon, I finally put on a raincoat and stepped out, wanting some fresh air and to stretch my legs a bit. I didn't wander far, just along the edge of the woods behind the cabin, umbrella in hand, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. That's when I saw them, bare footprints in the mud. They looked very new. The rain should have washed away any older ones. They weren't from boots or shoes, just bare feet. The strangest part was, the prints weren't heading toward the cabin. They led to a small clearing, and then they turned sharply into the woods. The hair on my arms stood up. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and who walks barefoot through the forest in this kind of weather? The prints didn't look small, so probably not a child. Still, I told myself maybe someone got turned around on a hike. Maybe they were just weird. I followed the trail with my eyes for a moment longer, but didn't dare go after them. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to forget about it. That night, the storm got worse. Wind thrashed the trees, and thunder rolled across the sky like distant drums. I lit a few candles and sat by the window, watching the lightning flash through the cloud. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the dark, just shadows flickering between trees. Maybe just tricks of the light, or maybe not. It was close to midnight when I heard footsteps sloshing through the mud outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, peering out through the curtain. At the edge of the open space, two women stood still. One was tall, with long, wet hair covering her face. The other was a bit hunched over, holding her arms tight to her chest, as if she was cold. They stood side by side, not moving or speaking. I turned on the torchlight, but the heavy rain made it hard to see them. Still, I could see their feet, bare, mud covered. I opened the door, just a crack, staying behind it. "Are you okay?" I called out. The shorter woman turned and ran into the woods without a sound, fast and graceful, like she'd done it 1,000 times. But the taller one stayed. She didn't speak, she didn't flinch. Just stood there, watching me through the rain. Then she said it. Food. Her voice was raw, like it hadn't been used in years. Caught off guard. I didn't know what to say. I went inside, grabbed a slice of bread and a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, smeared some on, and returned to the door. She was still there, unmoving. I handed it out to her without opening the door more than necessary. She took it with both hands and slowly walked to the front of the cabin. She sat in the mud, right in the storm, and started eating in a strange, slow way. She kept looking at me the whole time. A few minutes later, there was another knock. I opened the door just a crack to see her up close. "Water," she whispered. Again, I backed up, filled a cup, and returned. But this time, as I handed it to her, her hand shot out and grabbed mine. Her grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. I screamed and bit her finger as hard as I could without even thinking. She let out a strange, inhuman gasp and let go. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. Through the peephole, I watched as she stood again. She didn't look angry. She looked sad. Then very slowly, she turned and walked back into the forest, following the same direction as the first. But as she disappeared between the trees, I heard her voice again, low and wet with rain. "Come with me." Over and over. I shut the door, locked it, and stood there for what felt like an hour. I didn't sleep that night. I packed everything at dawn and left as soon as it was light enough to see the trail. The hike back was slippery and miserable. My nerves were shot. Every few minutes I thought I heard someone pacing just beyond the trees. Not walking exactly, more like circling. At one point I swear I heard laughter. It was soft, distant, and definitely female. I never saw them again. I don't know who they were, or why they were out there barefoot in the rain, but I haven't gone back to that cabin since. I don't think I ever will. I did some research once I got home. There had been reports, scattered ones, of women living off-grid in those woods. Some called them survivalists. Others thought they were part of a cult that disbanded decades ago. No one really knew. They were never caught doing anything illegal, but a few hikers went missing in that area over the years. I didn't go to the police. I didn't think they'd care about a muddy footprint or a creepy stare. But I did post anonymously online, described what happened. A few people replied. One woman said she'd met them too, years ago, and they'd asked her for matches. Another guy said they followed him for over a mile but never spoke. His photo showed two distant shapes in the rain, too blurry to prove anything. Part of me wanted to forget it. But a bigger part of me couldn't stop thinking about how cold her hand was, or how tightly she held on. She wasn't just hungry, she was desperate for something. Maybe food, maybe shelter, maybe connection. I still wonder why she didn't hurt me, and why the other one ran. Sometimes I think they were watching me for longer than I realized. Maybe even the night before I saw the prints. Maybe they were squatting nearby. Maybe they thought I was just another easy target. Someone alone, unarmed, out of touch. Or maybe they just needed help and didn't know how to ask for it. I don't have answers. But I changed after that trip. I double lock everything now. I look over my shoulder in parking lots. And whenever I go hiking, I carry pepper spray, 2 phones, and a first aid kit. But I also carry energy bars and a bottle of water, just in case. The events of last night left me quite shaken. I work as a dispatcher in a medium-sized Midwestern city, usually on the evening shift. It was 2 a.m. and I was driving home when I made the mistake of stopping for gas. Looking back, stopping at all was foolish. The gas station was poorly lit, and there were no other customers. I typically knew which areas were shady, and this didn't seem to be one of them. While pumping gas, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting on the curb across the parking lot. It was a cold night, and a light rain had just begun. The woman was drenched and was not wearing appropriate clothing for the weather. She saw me watching her and called out from across the lot. My next poor decision was to engage. I was concerned for her, so I approached to see if I could offer any help. She greeted me warmly and immediately explained her situation. She said she was trying to get home to the city, but no one would help her. The cab ride was $60 and she only had $40. She then asked if I could help her with the difference. I usually don't give money to panhandlers, but this woman seemed genuine and the weather was terrible. Given that my job centers around helping people, I agreed. I explained that I didn't have any cash, but I offered to get some from the ATM inside the station if she would come with me, and I would give her a few dollars. Unfortunately, the ATM wasn't working. I apologized, telling her there was nothing else I could do. She followed me back outside, idly chatting as I opened my car's driver door to get in. Then, to my shock, she got into my car. I was too stunned to speak, simply staring as she buckled herself into the passenger seat. The moment she was inside, her demeanor completely changed. She no longer seemed forlorn. Instead, she appeared extremely excited and restless. She suddenly insisted that I just take her to her aunt's house, saying her aunt could give her the money. Naturally, alarm bells were ringing loudly in my head. My first instinct was to tell her to get out, but a feeling deep in my gut told me that might be dangerous. She was already unpredictable, seemed to be high, and I had no idea if she had a weapon. Forcing her out seemed likely to provoke a violent reaction. I asked her where she wanted me to take her. She just told me to start driving and that she would tell me when to turn. I refused, stating that if she wanted me to consider driving her anywhere, I needed to know the destination. I had no real intention of driving her anywhere at all. She tried to reassure me that she wasn't a bad person and wasn't going to rob me, again urging me to just drive. I stood firm, asking for her aunt's address. As I kept questioning her, she became agitated. We still had not left the gas station parking lot. I considered getting out and going inside for help, but she seemed to know the sole attendant and was friendly with him. I also wasn't about to leave her alone in my car. Finally, she snapped, asking why I was asking so many questions, and if I didn't trust her since she thought we were friends. I told her that I worked at the police department and that asking questions was part of my job. At that, she completely flipped out, yelling about me being a snitch and trying to get her into trouble. She was losing control. Now more scared than ever, I just wanted her gone. My instincts still advised against trying to physically force her out. I decided to take a risk. I clarified that I wasn't a police officer, but only worked at the department, and then I suggested we drive to Walmart to see if they had a working ATM. My strategy was to get her out of the car as peacefully as possible and lose her in the store. She immediately liked the idea and calmed down. Driving off with this woman in my car was incredibly risky, but it seemed like my best option at the time. As we drove, she kept talking, her thoughts erratic and bouncing all over the place. She had trouble following through with any coherent thought. She expressed that she was glad we were friends and mentioned that she had 5 or 6 people trying to get her. She said she would come to my work tomorrow so we could arrest them. I gently deferred, saying we could discuss it tomorrow and reminding her she was trying to get home tonight. She agreed, then confusedly said she was trying to get out into the sticks, even though she had previously said she wanted to get to the city. She quickly corrected herself, insisting she meant the city, which was why the cab ride was so expensive. The details of the cab ride also changed. She confirmed she had $40, but then the cab ride, she said, was $60. After a brief silence, she asked if I was sure I couldn't take her to her aunt's house on Fuller Road, which was a different location than she'd mentioned earlier. She quickly dismissed the idea, saying her aunt wouldn't give her the money anyway, and then returned to asking if I could just take her to the city. It was terrifyingly obvious that she was completely untrustworthy because her story kept changing. When we pulled into the Walmart parking lot, she finally got out of my car, but only after I exited first, and she followed me to the store. Before we went to find an ATM, I told her I needed to use the restroom. My plan was to call the police from inside a stall, but she followed me into the bathroom. That's when things got really strange. She grabbed the crook of my arm and whispered a highly inappropriate question in my ear, asking if I liked being eaten out or receiving oral. I managed to tell her no, not as forcefully as I would have liked, and quickly got into a stall, locking the door as fast as I could. With the barrier between us, I spoke up, suggesting that some friends at the police department could probably help her better than I could, and I said I was going to call them so we could figure things out together. Again, at the mention of the police, she started screaming at me. I just kept reiterating that the police would help her. She eventually snapped at me and said she was leaving, then stormed out. But it wasn't over. She waited outside the bathroom to grab me later. Less than a minute after she left, she came back into the bathroom and started banging on the stall door. She said something that scared me more than anything else. She told me to come back to my car with her because she had left her beer in my car. I flatly told her no. I had seen her get into my car, and she had absolutely nothing with her but the clothes on her back. After that, she left the bathroom again and didn't return. I waited a good 5 minutes before exiting. I immediately found a manager who called the police for me. I was relieved that I was in a different police jurisdiction from the one where I worked, because I was mortified at how incredibly stupid I'd been all night, and would have been utterly embarrassed if a co-worker had responded. The officer who responded took my statement and advised me to be more careful in the future. He warned that panhandlers sometimes turn violent, and he mentioned a recent case where a woman matching her description had assaulted a good Samaritan who had stopped to help her. I learned my lesson about stranger danger and consider myself lucky to have escaped unharmed. I am glad my foolishness didn't cost me more. Fellow listeners, the next time you think about helping a stranger late at night, reconsider.
This event took place in the early 2000s, when my husband was frequently away, traveling for a major insurance company. Because of his work, our young daughter and I spent the majority of our days alone. A few years prior, we had bought a house on a somewhat isolated piece of land. The trip between town and home could often be difficult, especially during heavy rain. The last 5 miles of the road to our house was narrow and consisted of nothing more than loose gravel. My daughter and I found ourselves stranded on this section of road on a particularly bad night. I tried my best to keep our old Subaru on the road, but the rain made visibility almost impossible. It wasn't long before I misjudged a curve and ended up in the ditch. Fortunately, my husband had the foresight to sign us up for a roadside assistance program. I contacted them and was informed that the bad weather was keeping them busy, but they assured me they would get to us as soon as they could. Unsure how long we would be stuck, I made my daughter as comfortable as possible, and we waited. The rain soon stopped, allowing me to see how far we were from home. I estimated the house was about 2.5 miles away, and considered walking, but I remembered no one was home to retrieve the car later. Help was on its way, so I decided to remain where we were. Within 10 minutes of the accident, I saw approaching headlights and began to feel hopeful. However, the vehicle was not a tow truck. Instead, it was an older man driving a rusty pickup. When he saw our car, he slowed down and looked inside as he drove past. I initially thought he was going to offer to pull us out, but he continued down the road. I didn't dwell on it at the time, but 5 minutes later, the rusty truck approached us again, coming from the opposite direction at a very slow speed. He stared at me once more as he passed, making brief eye contact, but he didn't stop. Things began to seem strange, but I considered that perhaps he was lost and was merely turning around to return to the highway. I reminded myself that he wasn't obligated to help, and maybe he thought I was simply parked instead of stuck. I thought he probably wasn't from the area and was just trying to get home like I was. The situation didn't start to feel truly scary until I noticed the same truck approaching for a third time. It was now completely dark, and like most women, I felt much less safe after sunset, which made the circumstances even more unsettling. He performed his now familiar slow drive. This time, however, he stopped the truck after passing and quickly executed a 3-point turn. He was now facing us again, stopped about 10 yards away. Instead of getting out to offer assistance, he remained in his cab and watched for a few minutes. It was only then that he opened the door and began to step out of the truck. Almost as soon as his foot touched the pavement, a pair of headlights appeared from the other direction. The man stayed where he was, watching and waiting for a minute until the approaching vehicle was close enough to reveal itself as a tow truck. Once he saw this, he immediately jumped back into his cab, made a quick U-turn, and sped away from us. My heart pounded as I watched this scene unfold, and I was unable to relax until I could read the name of the company on the side of the tow truck. The tow truck driver wasted no time, pulling his truck in front of us and hooking up to my car. I was finally confident he was there to help, and I thank him. He had us out of the ditch in a matter of minutes, and we were back on the road. For the rest of the journey, I vigilantly searched for the rusty truck. Even as I drove up our own driveway, I was afraid I would see him lying in wait. Thankfully, he was not there, and I got my daughter safely into the house for the night. When my husband returned from his latest trip, I recounted the events of the storm, but I deliberately omitted the part involving the strange truck. I knew that sharing it would only cause him more stress while he was away, and at the time he had no alternative but to continue his trips. After the recent trouble, he went out and purchased a nearly new four-wheel drive Jeep for me. I was thrilled to get it and never got stuck again, even on the muddy sections of our property. It didn't take long for the memory of the stranger in the rusty truck to fade from my mind. However, for the next 2 weeks, I would catch myself searching for it anytime I drove on that stretch of road. I had almost completely forgotten about the incident until very recently, when I saw a similar truck at the store. It was not the same one, of course, but it caused the entire memory to come flooding back and motivated me to write this story. Fortunately, in the years since then, the county has paved and widened the roads, and my wonderful husband now gets to come home to us every night.
I have a few work stories from my hometown I can share. The first one happened when I was a 20-year-old college student working at a very rustic-looking gas station. It wasn't a standalone building. It was more of a small booth attached to a supermarket. The booth was located across a huge parking lot, separate from the main store, but the supermarket owned it. The booth faced the store, but directly behind it was a large area of woods. The door to the booth faced left, towards the woods, which was an important detail. The window in the booth was bulletproof, but it only covered the front, meaning you couldn't see directly to the left or right of the booth. I had been working at the station for a few months when a nasty storm suddenly hit one night. The rain was so intense you could barely see 10 feet, and the area was flooding. However, the supermarket, desperate for revenue, refused to close the booth. I showed up for my typical 5 to 11 p.m. shift in the pouring rain. 3 hours into the shift, the storm, which had become downright apocalyptic, caused a power outage. It was pitch black outside, and the rain was hammering down. I decided to sit tight inside the booth and wait for a manager to either dismiss me or fix the power. The phones were down, so I couldn't contact the main store, and no one was buying gas. I started doing my regular booth chores, such as cleaning the counter, counting cigarettes, and tidying the money drawer. Some background information is necessary. The booth door was supposed to be locked at all times. Unfortunately, a new hire had broken the key off in the lock. This forced the manager to break the lock just so they could get back inside. That lock hadn't been replaced yet, but we were instructed to pretend the door was still secured. There was a working deadbolt, but I found it annoying to bother with, and mostly left it unlocked. When I opened the door, I usually pretended to put a key in and made an audible chest sound. So, I was sitting in the unlocked booth in the pitch black rain, doing my chores, when I heard something outside. A muffled splashing sound. With zero visibility, I pressed my ear against the door and clearly heard someone walking around the booth in the rain before stopping right in front of the door. Before I could internally scold myself for leaving the door unsecured, I heard that same chished sound. This was followed by a dreadfully quiet couple of seconds. I waited, expecting to encounter some deranged person. Then, the footsteps began splashing away, back into the woods. I quickly locked the deadbolt and waited out the rest of my shift, quietly shaken. I would occasionally hear the footsteps outside, but whatever it was never tried to open the door again. Finally, my manager drove over in a truck to close me out for the night. Since I was relatively new, I did not want to appear delusional or crazy. So I never mentioned the incident to him or anyone else at the store. A few months later, a coworker I was training told me about hearing footsteps late one night during a storm, after the lock had thankfully been replaced. I simply told him it was nothing, but advised him not to open the door if he thought something was out there. I gave him this advice not because I feared looking delusional anymore, but because I truly could not explain the phenomenon. Fast forward a couple more months. I was now the second longest tenured person working at the booth, which meant younger coworkers sometimes called me when they made a mistake. On one of my nights off, I received a call from a high schooler coworker. I'll call Rhea. It was 9:30 p.m. I picked up the phone, and Rhea was hysterical. She was saying her trainee was missing, followed by lots of sobbing. Confused and a little annoyed that she called me first, I tried to prompt her to call the police if he was kidnapped. She insisted she couldn't call the police because they wouldn't believe her. My next thought was to ask why she hadn't told a manager, but she just cried more. She said the managers wouldn't understand. More agitated than confused, I agreed to drive out there to calm her down. I got dressed, went to the booth, and parked nearby. There were no customers. Rhea was just standing inside the booth, staring wide-eyed at the door. When she saw me, she opened the door, started sobbing again, and told me to hurry inside. Eventually, I got her to stop crying long enough to explain what had happened. She had been training a new guy named Matt, who was about my age. She described him as feeling off, like a robot or something, and said he kept staring at her in a dazed manner. Several times he would stop talking mid-sentence. He would ignore her attempts to address it. She was becoming very uncomfortable and was about to call the main store about him when he started humming. She described the noise as a heavy, buzzing sound, like someone trying to imitate a purring cat. When she reached for the phone, he reacted by grabbing her hand and staring at her. She started yelling and warned him to stop. He let go of her hand, opened the door, and suddenly sprinted off into the woods and out of sight. She said he returned a few minutes before I arrived and asked to be let back in, but she refused. He then ran back into the woods. At this point, I suspected he might have been high on meth, which was common in the neighborhood, or that she was being overly dramatic. Regardless, the story sounded dangerous, and we needed to call the police. I told her we were going to call the police, and then walk outside to wait for them. She refused to go outside, insisting she could almost feel him waiting out there. Tired, irritated, and still skeptical of her story, I decided she could stay in the booth to call the police while I checked the tree line. I took a weak little flashlight I had stashed there after the first incident and went outside to scan the tree line. I barely began shining the light when the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I heard the humming noise. Rhea's description had been accurate. It sounded like cicadas mixed with heavy breathing. I looked inside the booth, and she was curled up in the chair, staring to my left. I did not even look in the direction she was staring. I immediately bolted back toward the booth. I had left the keys with her, and she was frozen, unable to get up to let me in. I was pounding on the door and screaming at her to open it. The humming abruptly stopped, and I heard something behind me and to the left. It was Matt. He was standing right on the edge of the trees. My panic intensified, and at that moment, Rhea finally let me into the booth. I immediately slammed the deadbolt shut. Suddenly, Matt was right outside the booth, asking to be let back in. He kept apologizing and saying he had gotten nervous back there, repeating the same few excuses while circling the booth. This continued for about 5 minutes until the police arrived. As soon as he saw them, Matt began running off into the woods again. I had to explain the situation to both the police and our manager, though I left out any mention of the strange humming. As far as I know, Matt never returned. So he was fired, and Rhea eventually quit. That was the end of it. I was never particularly close with Rhea, as she was still in high school while I was in college. so we never discussed what happened afterward. I still have no idea what occurred that night. Perhaps Matt was just a heavily drugged addict capable of making strange noises. This might explain why he ran when the police showed up. But to this day, the whole incident remains a mystery in my mind.
I have always lived and worked in Portland, Maine, where every spring brings rain in biblical proportions. It's a huge inconvenience, but it's something you learn to tolerate. You invest in a good umbrella and a waterproof coat and simply muddle on, like any good Mainer does. Though I often thought that if some people from California saw the weather we endure, they would likely call us maniacs. For the most part, the rain is just a minor irritation, a price we pay for the magnificent autumns enjoyed by leaf peepers from all over the country. However, one dark and rainy night, I discovered that the climate here can make simply living here dangerous. Picture the scene. It was raining cats and dogs. I was walking back to my apartment in an older part of town after dark. One of the streets on my route, which dated back to the early 1800s, was lined with cobblestones, and the sidewalks were made of large, flat slate, like slabs. These slabs become incredibly slippery in the spring and fall, likely due to a type of algae or moss growing on them. I'm not a biologist, but all I know is that they can turn into a freaking ice rink at certain times of the year. On this particular occasion, it was more of a death trap. I already knew how slippery it was, but as I walked, I received a text. I assumed it was from my boss, hopefully regarding the raise I'd been seeking. The light from my phone must have temporarily thrown off my vision and, in turn, my footing. One moment I was walking along, minding my own business, and the next I was lying on the sidewalk, the wind knocked out of me. It felt as if the ground beneath me had simply vanished. My first coherent thought was a stream of expletives. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't find my feet. My left foot was flopping around in a way that made my stomach churn. That's when a throbbing pain began to shoot through my leg. It quickly escalated until my entire body was racked with agony. Every movement sent a searing pain zapping up my calf and thigh, and I realized I had suffered a serious break or sprain. Normally, I would have immediately called 911, but my phone must have slipped out of my hand when I fell. When I looked around for it, it was nowhere to be seen. I briefly wondered if it had slipped off the sidewalk, but then a sewer drain, the metal grid kind, caught my attention. It occurred to me that my phone might have clattered straight down into the sewer as I fell. It was a horrendous stroke of misfortune. I figured it wouldn't be long until a passerby stumbled across me, and I could get help. But I looked around, growing increasingly soaked by the relentless New England deluge. I realized there wasn't a soul on the streets. People avoid going out in the worst of the rain, even if they are accustomed to it. It suddenly dawned on me that if I wanted help, I would have to call out, or even scream, for it. So, I was forced to actually scream for help. As weird and prudish as it sounds, I didn't know what was worse, the pain or the sheer embarrassment of having fallen, and being unable to get up. I gave 3 loud shouts, asking if anyone could hear me, and telling them I was badly hurt. No one responded. I could clearly see lights on in the windows of apartment buildings only yards away. I knew people could hear me, but they were choosing not to help. It was crushing to realize that people knew I was there, but wouldn't lift a finger. But I suppose that's just life in big cities now. People are terrible, assuming everything is a scam. A few minutes went by, and it slowly became clear that no one was coming. If I wanted to make any progress toward the emergency room, I would have to drag myself along the wet sidewalk until I found someone compassionate enough to help. Just before I was forced to undergo this indignity, I saw a person's silhouette near a streetlight. I began calling out to this potential savior. You would think that seeing a girl lying in the street, calling for help with obvious pain, would make someone hurry. But this individual seemed to notice me, stopped for a second, and then carried on walking toward me at the same speed, not saying a word. The overwhelming relief I first felt quickly turned to dread The person approaching me was not giving off any of the compassionate, helpful vibes I had expected. In fact, it was the opposite. When I told him that I thought I had broken my ankle and begged him to call 911, he remained completely silent. Seconds later, I was looking up at him, the rain splashing in my eyes. With his hood up, I could barely make out any of his facial features. He asked what had happened to me, sounding barely concerned, as if he hadn't heard me explain the issue just moments before. I reiterated my injury and just begged him to call 911, skipping the backstory. He didn't move. He made no attempt to get out a cell phone to make the call. Instead, he simply towered over me, silently staring as if I were some kind of curiosity. I remembered asking if he could see my phone anywhere, as I had dropped it. At that moment, he actually started looking around, which momentarily restored a little of my hope that he intended to help. In hindsight, I don't think he would have handed it over if he'd found it, because his next move, which I initially mistook for him trying to help me up, was to start patting me down for valuables before he simply grabbed my purse. I was stunned into silence as he rifled through the contents, taking a few loose bills. I couldn't believe anyone could be so callous, even in a big city like Portland. I was disappointed, angry, and in pain. But I wasn't outright scared until he took out my work photo ID, stared at it for a moment, and slid it into his pocket. That's when I realized this wasn't just about monetary gain. He wasn't merely a thief or an opportunist, but an outright predator. The thought of what he might do next completely terrified me. He didn't walk away with the money and my ID. He just carried on standing over me, staring, probably delighted at how helpless I was. He saw how he could do whatever he liked to me with no one around to stop him. A 38-year-old woman. I felt like crying like a little girl. I begged him not to hurt me, to just leave with the money he'd taken. I think he just got off on my distress, but I was in no position to fight back. The best I could hope for was to hit him with my keys, if he tried to take things further. Just as I was reaching for them, lying discarded on the sidewalk, I heard one of the sweetest sounds of my life. A man's voice asked if everything was all right. The voice was polite, but aggressive and accusatory. Someone had finally emerged from one of the nearby apartment buildings. Hearing the voice, the hooded man started walking off just as chill as ever. The new arrival immediately challenged the man walking away, then looked back at me and called back inside, presumably for his wife, asking someone to call the police. He then rushed out to ask if I was okay, which triggered a huge wave of ugly crying as I pointed to my messed up ankle in between shakes of my head. A few hours later, I was laid up in the hospital with a broken ankle, high as a kite on the best medication my insurance could buy. I gave a statement to the police, had a good cry with my mother when she visited, and then informed all my co-workers that I wouldn't be seeing them for a few months. I got some small amount of closure when I heard the man was arrested for petty theft. Apparently, he had a history of drug addiction and mental illness, and had committed a handful of opportunistic robberies over the last few years. As a result, this last strike was going to send him back to jail for a few years, which I take a great deal of comfort in.